exciting day for us. We run the Brit Technology Impact Series each year, and we just crossed 10 years this past year of the series, and have kind of been enjoying looking back at where the series started just over a decade ago. So this is a fun part of what I get to do every day. We're excited today to have Joe Bonefas here. He is at Discovery Financial Services. He has a really interesting job, which I won't go into detail because I can't do it justice the way he can, obviously. But this year we are focused, as many of you know, we're focused on the understanding of trust in the context of where we are in the digital age and how technology enables, maybe harms our understanding of trust, and what can be done about it. How should we think about it as managers and as running businesses? So today we're going to look at some of the overlapping kind of areas of trust in Joe's business at Discover Financial, which he'll explain a little bit more about. But this is his first visit to Tuck, and we want to make sure he understands the great host that we are. So please join me in welcoming Joe to Tuck.
All right.
And please do feel free to ask questions. He said, I like questions,
yeah.
So feel free to dive into questions.
So thank you very much, Patrick. I'm very happy to be here. So my name is Joe Bonefas. I've been with Discover now for 28 years. I was asking kind of what the rough average age of this class was. So I think my time at Discover may kind of roughly comport to this group. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through a little bit of an arc. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my role within the organization. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Discover to put some stuff in context, and then really help start to explain the different patterns that we have that really rely on trust as an organization. And then if we do it right, we'll kind of then arc into some of the new technologies that are kind of out there that help us, or the fraudster, helps one side or the other either kind of defraud a customer or kind of protect a customer, and kind of take you through that. Sound good? We'll do it all, hopefully here in about 40 minutes. All right, a little bit about myself. So I've got some of the background that I have here. So I have a couple of degrees from Northwestern. I have a Master's of Science as well as an MBA. I have mentioned that I've also been involved with Discover for a long time, which I've won kind of a number of awards over the years for some of the disruptive innovations that we've had. So I led the effort of getting us into China, getting us to issue a card at the time that was known as the Dual Card. It was launched with Walmart. It had the attributes of a private label credit card as well as a general purpose credit card. And some of those things don't sound innovative so much today, but back when we were first kind of pushing those things, they were really helping kind of define what you can do in the industry. So I spent a lot of time thinking about where we're heading in the long term. My role in the organization today is I'm a vice president in business technology in an area called innovation and partnerships. So I think about business expansion, whether it's coming from a technical innovation, and we kind of think about it is how do you really kind of gain authority over the emerging technologies and see how those technologies can kind of work for Discover, or is it's through a lot of the partnerships. What can we do with the fintech communities? How can we deal with kind of Apple and Facebook? How do you think about the globalization and working in markets around the world? So that's my background. The one thing I do want to express is the views that you're going to get today are views of, from me. They're not necessarily those of Discover. All right, a little bit about Discover. So how many people have a Discover card here? So, all right, that's good. So Discover card is where Discover really made its name. We were what was known initially as a monoline bank. We were a bank that actually issued one product, and it was the credit card. That's how we got into the marketplace. We launched in 1986, and from that, we really grew as an organization. We grew into a household name, and we're really known on that as an issuing side of the business. So the way this slide is broken out is on the left side of this slide, it talks about our direct bank and our consumer-based businesses. So we have a credit card, and we have a very large lending and deposits business. On the right side of the slide, it talks about our Discover Global Network. So you can think of our Discover Global Network as a competitor to Visa and MasterCard and American Express, right? So we operate this network under 3 different brand names. One of those is the Discover Network, which is the kind of the largest one that you would see for those who have the card. If you flip over your plastic, you'll see that. We also own the Diners Club International Network, which we bought from Citibank. That is a large network around the world, pretty diminished here in the US, but if you go to some markets around the world, you'll find it's the leading network in those markets. And then we own the Pulse network, which is an EFT, electronic funds transfer, debit network. You know how the debit networks formed, they were all kind of first, regional networks, and then they really ended up with a few national networks. And so we own Pulse, which is one of the top national networks across the country. Going back, I don't want to really diminish the issuing side of the business. I mentioned we started as a credit card company, as a monoline. In 2007, 2008, the timeline right in there, we started getting into other consumer lending and deposits business. So we have a very large direct bank business. We compete with companies maybe you've heard of, like Ally Financial and others. We're a very large bank there. And we have a very large personal lending space. We also deal with home equity as well. So we've gotten into a few of those lines of business.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How did you guys get into Sears and out of Sears?
Okay, so the question is really around Sears and our formation. So Sears owned Discover and started the company in 1986. And at the time, Sears had this philosophy called stocks and socks, right? And so the belief was that if you walked into a retail store and you were buying things like socks and pants and stuff, that you would also have an interest in doing your financial services. Well, it turns out, and by the way, Sears owned a number of large companies. They owned Allstate, they owned Coldwell Banker, they owned Dean Witter, Discover. So they started us. In 1993, Sears decided that that was a failed strategy, and they spun off to the public Allstate. They spun off Dean Witter, Discover and Company. So we were actually part of Dean Witter at the time. And then they sold some of their other things like Coldwell Banker into the private. We existed under Dean Witter from 1993 till 1997. And in 97, Discover merged with Morgan Stanley. And we stayed as part of Morgan Stanley for 10 years. So in 2007, Morgan Stanley spun off Just Discover. They kept the Dean Witter brand with Morgan Stanley, and they spun off Just Discover as an independent company. So since 2007, we have been an independent company. And so I've been fortunate to have worked there through all those ownership phases. So, and each one's a little bit different, right? Each one has its own goals, and kind of being an independent company since 2007 has been a very enjoyable phase. All right, so this is just a little bit more detail about the network. And the reason I wanted to give you this additional detail is the Discover Network is not only those 3 brands that I showed you, but we also have 2 other businesses that are a little bit behind the scenes. One is a white label business. So Discover has taken its assets and said, look, we'll make it available to other brands who want to come on it. Basically, we'll create the rails if somebody else is willing to create the rules. And we've done that with a company that's in the B2B space called Ariba. We actually run the Ariba Pay network. We also had worked with PayPal, and we had the PayPal physical network that was operating. PayPal doesn't really utilize that. We're also the network that runs Apple Pay Cash. So those of you who use Apple Pay Cash product, you'll often be coming across our network. On the very bottom, we have these global network alliance partners. And this is an area that we call net to nets. So there's a lot of networks around the world that are very strong in their local market, in their geography. So if you take Elo, they're very strong in Brazil. They don't operate really outside of Brazil, but in Brazil they operate. Or you go to Korea, there's a network called BC Card. We have worked with them and says, when your customer leaves Korea and wants to travel around the world, do they have a network that they can use? Yes, they do. It's the network that we have, the Discover Diners network around the world. So you see all those partners that are on the bottom are just representation of networks that we have formed alliances with around the world. Some of this stuff will become a little bit material as we go forward. So this is let's see how this one, I guess this one auto builds. This really talks about the erosion of trust, right? What is happening around the world, and sometimes specifically in the credit card industry, right? So when Target gets hacked, or Capital One, has kind of had their issue with Amazon recently, and some of these large processors get hacked, it tarnishes our industry as well as actually has true financial loss for the organization. Some card numbers get stolen, somebody is able to get a fraudulent transaction out of the network. And so trust really is been eroding, and it's been eroding for a little while because there's these large kind of honeypots of information that the fraudsters are able to go after, and once they get them, they can cause pretty serious damage. But if you're not directly affected, it certainly raises the worry that you have that somebody's going to be able to steal some of your financial information, if not your identity. And so really what we have is this kind of flow that's been happening, is that there's an erosion in trust, which is asking kind of companies to really kind of secure their data. And are they really being able to really truly secure it? And now we've got privacy laws being enacted. We've got stuff that's happening around the globe, but more closer to home, you've got the CCPA, which is the California, I think it's California Consumer Protection Act, but it's something that is really around this notion, can your data really be kind of held? Does it need to be locked up? Can you ask for it to be kind of purged and right to be forgotten? And then ultimately there's a company response either to the laws or what the kind of the demand is for the consumers, right? So that's just kind of a nice way that I kind of think about it and represent it. All right, so these slides here is really what is relationship built on. So how important is right party contact? So when you think about the two sides of the business that I talk about, and I am going to try to talk about them discreetly at times. So on the one side, you have the direct to bank kind of relationship. So how many times you kind of call up your credit card company and you say, can you tell me what has been happening on my account? I might want to make a payment. I'm a little worried about this. And they go through this whole method of identifying you, right? They ask information around, what's your mother's maiden name? Can you give me your birthday? Can you reveal something about yourself in order for me to give trust? And you can see that how important that is in that business, because if we get the right party contact, I'm able to kind of interact and allow you to update things, maybe put on a new authorized user on your account, but really give you true entitlements. If I get that wrong, we're opening ourselves up to really pretty substantial fraud. So if you think maybe what the credit line is, if the credit line on an account is $5,000 or $10,000 and somebody's able to change and social engineer the information on there, you're opening up for each one of those events a pretty significant amount of money to be lost. On the network side, when somebody's actually trying to make a purchase, we want to make sure that that purchase is in context, that that credit card that's being used at that moment, is it in the right city, in the right context, in the right way? Because those are the individual events that somebody is either legitimately trying to do or to fraudulently do. And if you're a legitimate person, you don't want your access denied, right? We were talking earlier, I'm now out east. Does the company know I'm out east? When they first see a transaction occur, do they think it's legitimate or do they think it's suspicious? And if they think it's suspicious, do they stop it and ask you to reveal yourself? Well, if I'm a legitimate card member, that irritates me. I'm less likely to use the card, less likely to continue to use the product. So we have this whole system that you want to make sure you treat your good customers right, not alienate them, and you want to protect yourself from the bad customer trying to get in. And the expectation of all of you and all of our consumers is that we get this right. And if we can get it right and we can silently get it right, you're even happier, right? If we don't have to interrupt the experience. All right, so this gets me a little bit more, and then I'll stop maybe after these next two slides and see kind of what other questions are out there. But this is just really kind of two more kind of quick background perspectives on kind of the arc of what's happening. So in the 1980s and before, a lot of times what you had is the ability to go to the bank, right? So those who have been around a while perhaps had passbook savings or went to their branch every week and they physically appeared, right? Then we moved into the fact that people could start, either we had branch banking or you can go through the phone, right? You would call up your bank, right? And so these channels are starting to appear that says, you can now actually access the information remotely. So how do I authenticate somebody who's calling in? Right? What we don't have on there is ATMs start to appear in this time frame. Then we start getting banking over the web, right? You can log on and you can pull up your bank, right? Then you eventually can get mobile apps. Now we've got intermediaries that are coming in that I don't want to bank directly, but I want to go through a mint.com and I want to give access to Mint to get my information from my bank. So some aggregator or third party is getting access on your behalf. And now there's a lot of pressure to give services with the home speakers, right? So, if you've got Amazon Alexa or HomePod or whatever they are in your home, you've got an expectation now that this new channel can be made available to you as a consumer. And you can start to see, without me even breaking into the equation, how difficult this becomes for companies. If I want to service you in the medium that you want to be serviced, I have to be able to not only deal with you when you arrive face to face, but I got to deal with you increasingly as you become more and more remote. The second way to look at it is what is happening around these physical devices. So when we started thinking about things, I said, okay, you can think about this as a plastic, right? But let me change your reference, and let me tell you that this is a hardware device where the data is provisioned securely onto the magnetic stripe and delivered securely via US mail to you. What is this? This is a hardware device, right? But it's not a hardware device that I controlled as a company. It was a hardware device that you bought someplace else. And is the data on the phone with your credit card information provisioned by me? Well, if we put it into the mobile wallets, that's exactly what we kind of were part of the invention of figuring out how to provision over the air all of the credentials that were on the card into the phone. That's procured by the company. But how many times have you put in your credit card number directly into an app and held it there? It's provisioned by you, right? And so I got to start thinking about that this device is actually less secure than the plastic that we gave you because the way the data gets provisioned onto it. So as we start thinking about the authorization environment, you could represent it as one of the plastics that I gave you. You can come through the phone. You can do a voice authorization, right? The merchant, that doesn't happen as much anymore, but you can call up and you can say, hey, the systems are down, let me do a voice authorization. Or maybe your mail order, telephone order. You're not even present in the facility and somebody is actually doing the authorization on your behalf. And on the bottom, now we're representing a whole new ecosystem, right? The Internet of Things, right? So things are now starting to authorize on your behalf. The classic one in our world is the refrigerator is ordering the eggs, right? It knows what it needs, and so it's going to place the order for you. So it's ordering on your behalf. Well, what happens if it gets it wrong? And what happens if instead of 12 eggs, you get 12 dozen eggs, right? And these are the kind of the changes in the environment. All right, maybe I'll go through this slide and then I'll see kind of where there's questions. So what I can kind of do is start to represent the equation as the distance between the consumer and the company, right? And one way to say the distance is kind of defined by the channel. When I physically appeared, we had really no distance, right? You kind of recognize me. Maybe I come in every few weeks, and we can have a relationship. I'm coming into the same branch all the time, and so we established this notion of trust. When it's on the phone, my distance is starting to get separated. You're trusting the fact that my phone comes, my conversation on the phone line. Maybe it's a voice you recognize and hear. And then we continue to get further and further away from the customer when they're coming over electronically. Now I don't even get their voice, the timbre of what they're saying. I have to rely on the information they're putting on the website. And then I kind of bring in another view of this and say, consumers are actually now hiding behind devices, right? So what I actually see is maybe the IP address of this, right? Something that's coming from the phone, and I've got to basically begin to believe in this distance that the person on the other side of this phone is the legitimate customer, right? So this gets increasingly complex. All right, now that I've established some fundamental background on my industry and stuff, what questions are there? Nothing yet? No penalties for asking questions, so yes.
Within Discover, how are you guys organized internally from a kind of BD innovation standpoint to capture this complex ecosystem? And you guys have B2C, B2B kind of relationships that you're working on. I'm just interested in kind of the overall structure and how you guys think about it.
Okay, so the question, I think everybody can hear, but the question is really on kind of overall structures, like how is the company itself organized? So our company is actually organized first by just two divisions, right? And the first division is the direct bank segment. And the direct bank represents, when that previous slide, what the consumer businesses are, the credit card as well as the bank, the other lending and deposits. The other side is the payments networks piece, which is, as I kind of mentioned, not only services the Discover business, but it services all of those brands as well as banks around the world. So that's our main organization. As far as innovation, now innovation then is one of those things where you kind of bring stuff together for efficiency and you send it to the kind of the ends for creativity, right? So you don't want to really do innovation centrally. So we have innovation in those different business segments that I pointed out. And then I have a role that broadly follows what Gartner consulting would call the IT instigator pattern. So I run innovation across right now all of those different areas and help think about how will technology kind of disrupt and change what some of those different interaction models might be, whether you're card, bank, or payments. That being said, my background, I helped create, I'm actually kind of considered maybe the father of the authorization network. I helped create a lot of what our network assets are today, and so I have a very deep understanding of how the payments business works. So the payments organization, I think, relies a little bit more on our IT instigation role than maybe some of the other areas of the organization. But I think innovation is one of those things that we're still trying to figure out how to get it right, and how do you get a little bit more of. So you guys all have heard of entrepreneurship. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is intrapreneurship, right? So how do you create new, either businesses is maybe a little bit more extreme, but maybe features and capabilities by internally looking at what we can do and driving it. The problem that I end up having is a lot of times it feels like maybe we're pushing on a string where we maybe have a good idea, but we feel like a startup within the company, and I still have to get advocates in the company that are actually going to deploy things. So some of you guys, has anybody worked in agile methodology and value streams, right? So it's a great philosophy, right? The philosophy is that we'll work on the highest value projects, and we'll really kind of pull them through the network, and we'll make sure that the time frame is really short, and we'll work on small batches. Well, how do you deal with long-term things that are unknown, right? To hey, let's try out this new idea or do this. And so value streams have a tendency to lean to the narrow and now. And when innovation comes in, it doesn't really feel like it's something that has immediate value. So value streams have a tendency to really discourage working on them, even though if you talk to the organizations, everybody's emotion is there. But when you look at the data, we end up, I think, still leaning a little bit into the data. That's a long way to saying that innovation, I think, is still very much of an art. The science would be nice if we could, get it right, but it really is an art, and it really relies on people with some personality and some sales capability to kind of grab both the emotional interest and then help figure out how to get it prioritized within the company. Other questions? Yes.
So regarding like new devices and there being customer demand to be able to pay through your iPhone, for example, to what extent is the bank, you guys, partnering with the device manufacturers to kind of outline how the security should be done versus it's secure, just build around, these kind of plugins?
So the question is really around kind of the collaboration model of how, as a company, do we work with the device manufacturers. And so that's actually a fairly complicated answer, because the device manufacturers that we have are not only consumer devices, but they're also the accepting devices. I think the easiest way for me to answer that question is it's an industry problem, not a company problem. So we belong to industry groups in order to help kind of vet out the process and make sure that as an industry, the phone manufacturers know how to work with the credit card companies. So we're not doing it by ourselves. So you have companies such as like EMVCo, which deal a lot with the standards settings around kind of the credit card industry and the device manufacturers. On the acceptance side, you've got a number of organizations that work in to make sure that the phone distance to the terminal is right. We know where what will happen. We know what data needs to be exchanged. And we all really operate across the same standards. We may have our own little flavor for our business and our brand, but largely they go off of the exact same standard. So for example, the EMV book is really defines a lot of the data that you're going to exchange. I think one of the fascinating things for me, and being around the industry for a long time, is this device, when it was just mag stripe, it's a one-way device, right? It has data, and we kind of send it up into the authorization system, right? They swipe it through the terminal. This device, or when they brought the chip on it, actually, and kind of it's actually, it starts a conversation, and the conversation that it has, it's bidirectional. It starts it between this device and the terminal, right? And they're looking for the common app that they can exchange information on. They're looking for entitlements. Hey, can I make the decision locally? Do I have to send it up? So all that's based on standards in our industry, not Discover standards. And those standards really define the terminal manufacturers. They define how in the payments that we're going to work together. So, yeah?
Where do neural computers fit into your model?
So the question is around neural networks and neural computing. I actually don't know if I can kind of give you a definition around purely neural networks, but the way that we kind of view data and trying to use data as well as perhaps a lot of the kind of the AI techniques, whether they're neural or not, is to deal with it primarily around fraud and the ability for us to kind of detect fraud. You know, fraud is still, you know, a big piece of the losses of the company, right? That you've got to figure out the way that it's a legitimate transaction, legitimate card member. So we deal a lot with around kind of, you know, thinking of this and looking to do a lot of either pattern recognition and that type. We have several fraud systems that we use because we don't treat fraud as a single problem. It's layered. And so that's largely where we would use that type of technique or technology, but I am specifically not aware of if we're using neural networks or where we're having it deployed. So. All right, let me advance this a little bit and keep an eye on the time, and then we'll talk about some new stuff, and then we'll get into more questions. So I heard this from company one time, and I really loved it, EDNA. And EDNA stood for electronic DNA, and that's really the question about, you know, how do we start to know that the customer is on the other side of the device, and how do we start to actually think about the device? And so there's some really cool techniques that a lot of the fintechs have come up with over the years that says, is this device the same? Is it in context? So there's a lot of things that you have individually put on your device, right? And yours is going to look different than yours and right down the line. And so you put a song list on there, right? You put apps on there. And so when this device comes in, they think of this as the electronic DNA of the device. What can they legitimately read off the device? And can they say, well, the last time I saw this device and this time that I see the device, is it kind of roughly the same? Is the song list roughly the same? Are the apps roughly the same? And if it is, then I can think it's probably the right device. If I see it substantially different, then I got to ask a question. Well, maybe it's a new device. Maybe you went to the Apple and got a brand new one, or maybe it's not you, on there. And so we start to have to begin to rely on information that we can impute along the way to start saying, is this likely something that we believe that is legitimate? And this is well, let me go through a couple of these other slides first. So you probably have seen some form of this slide before, right? And so we talk about multi-factor authentication stuff. Well, what are the factors, right? And so these are the factors that they are. There's something you are, right? For example, biometrics, right? Nobody's going to be you. That's you. And then it's either something you have, right? You have things that we gave you. We have the credit card. You have the phone. Things that are in your possession. And then it's something that right? It's a passcode, right? Something that you can privately reveal. Maybe it's your favorite word, or and then on multi-factor, what we do is we try to start combining these things along the way that says, hey, what's two-factor authentication? Ideally, it's one factor from each category, right? It's either something you have and something you are, or something you are and something you know. It's not necessarily two factors from the same category, right? And that's the way that we begin to get greater assurance that we're talking to the legitimate party. The other part of the equation I'll give you is kind of active and silent, right? So what are active things, right? We challenge you at times. Once again, kind of the survey side, how many people have had a transaction, you come to them and say, well, here, I'm going to send you a link and type in the code that I've just sent to you, right? It's a very natural way of doing things, right? That's an out of band, right? We're taking advantage of the fact that you have a device or have an email, then we can send it to you out of band. What we do at that time, though, is we interrupt the flow, right? You're having a nice conversation, you're trying to do something quickly, and you say, okay, hang on, I'm going to push you, something, and you're going to have to reveal it back. And we've often created that like step-up authentication. So maybe I'm going to allow you to do a bunch of transactions. You're doing simple, $50 transactions, and now you want to do a $5,000 transaction, right? I may have said, well, the authentication that I've done before is fine, but now because you're doing a high value transaction, I might want to step up, right, the authentication. So under that scenario, maybe I'll interrupt the flow, and we'll both get greater assurance that you're the right party. Silent authenticators are often things that we can detect maybe in the behavior, right? You always go to Target on Tuesdays. It's Tuesday, you're at Target, boy, that's in context, right? We can take a look at it. We can also, there are some interesting things, these are not things that we're doing, but kind of interesting things around behavioral biometrics. There's some companies that we've seen out there doing gait analysis, G-A-I-T, gait. And so with the technology that's in the phone, they can tell, hey, you always hold the phone a certain height, maybe you swing it, you carry it in your hand when you walk, and I can start saying that's legitimate, that's in context. Maybe when Joe and I are walking together, the two phones can kind of detect one another, and we change our pace when we're walking together. And that's a form of behavioral, biometrics that we're actually kind of being able to detect the behavior and impute what's happening. And the other one that's kind of interesting here is things. So we're actually playing around with some little technologies, but like little like nano dots that you can, if a manufacturer issued your glasses, your phone, your shoes, all had a little device in it, a little nano dot, and we could detect those by the phone, we could begin to say that I can detect you by things that are around you, right? So it's not only you, it's the environment's right, the environment's in context. And these are all types of authenticators that are available, assuming that the customer kind of gives us permissible use and permissional purpose. Yes?
Are your silent behavioral contexts opt-in or opt-out?
So that's a big question for the industry, and I'll tell you kind of a little story. Right now, we are looking at a lot of these things, and for the most part, it's kind of a combination, right? So some of the stuff that you're opting into is like when you use the app and stuff. You're opting into the fact that you're using the app on there. Other types of things, I've just given you kind of a flavor of stuff that's available in the industry. We're not doing those yet. So things like if we said we were going to go to like, we're going to authenticate you by things that are around you, we need to create a policy on that. But for the most part, we want to have permissible use, right? As a company, we want to say, yeah, you should, be aware of kind of what we're doing for, kind of authentication purposes and silent authenticators. So policies will have to be written based on, kind of these things that become available.
And when you say industry standard, are you saying that like if all credit card companies said that they would make this a opt-out process, that every bank would have an opt-out process, or what is that?
That's what I mean when I say industry standards. There's not an industry standard on this, and one of the things that we find is regulated entities, banks and stuff, have a tendency to be a little bit more responsible in terms of making sure that there's kind of clear permissible use, but not every single fintech will actually have that, right? They'll let maybe challenge to their policy and stuff ultimately form the views on it. So you find that some of the other players in the marketplace may be a little bit more aggressive in some of their decisions and push the envelope a little bit, but that's kind of the trade-off. Let me take the question in the back and I'll come up here.
Yeah, how do you balance like having like doing these things so that consumers trust that you're that like their money isn't being taken by some fraudulent person, with then them trusting you like with their personal data about, say, like their behavioral habits or things like that. It seems like
interesting balance, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to ultimately find out. One of the ways that Discover does things is that we expose a lot of information and give the customer control, right? So Discover created, and I think I got a slide in this, but I'll just take it a little bit out of order. Discover created the ability to freeze the account, our ability to have you get alerts on different things, spending and stuff. So by creating transparency, we're able to put the customer in control. But as far as your kind of question about specifically balancing, I think it's going to be an interesting thing for us to ultimately figure out is, you want to look at information that's available to you to make the right decision, but you don't want to overstep your bounds, right? That's always the, kind of the challenge that we have in the marketplace. All right, we got a lot of questions, which is good. I'm going to come up here, and then I'm going to go to the back and then there. So 1, 2, 3. So we had a question here.
I had a very similar question on the balance. So yeah.
Okay, so we're down to 2 questions. All right.
Yeah, I was wondering if you ever consider the R&D investment to get a certain confidence in your trust model, and make a decision to do 80%, 90%, 95, 100 because
Yeah.
it's a big investment, right? And it's a learning process. And what stage you take it to market, and how do you make the decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and that's what we're always trying to do, is find what indicators, are predictive, that you have permissible use for, that will give you the best confidence. It's an odds game, right? At the end of the day, we're playing an odds game, and if you can shrink the aperture of getting it wrong, then it's a much better opportunity. So there's another company that I saw that was interesting. The company, I think they're still kind of in business operating, but the company was called Socure, and they were looking at your social profile, right? And they were trying to say, is everything in context? So you have all of these public digital footprints that you're creating your whole life, right? You're, from the moment you're born, and you're kind of registered, and you could then go out and maybe get a social security card, and your schooling and all of that, everything keeps getting registered. And they're trying to say, is it in context? If everything has happened, within 50 miles of where you were born, it seems to be really strongly in context. If I all of a sudden get one outlier, they're saying, well, maybe your social veil has been pierced, right? And so you get companies like that that'll come to us and say, we think we have something that's predictive, and then it's a question, is it predictive, and is it solely predictive, or does it have to be layered onto some kind of other things? So there's always this question of outreach, and how do you kind of take a look at some of this stuff?
So my question is relates to the balance. So you mentioned giving customers transparency, and you talked about letting them. It sounded like some of the examples you gave were more around giving control around things like freeze my account, but not necessarily letting customers know that, hey, we're tracking your gate. Not that you're doing that.
Right. Yeah, we're not.
But like a lot of these things, how much is that known to your customers? Like, do they know that you're looking at their biometrics? Do they know that you are? Things like that. And how much responsibility do you feel to share exactly what you're doing to ensure they're?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, probably beyond kind of my ability to ultimately answer that, because that's the kind of the balance between making sure that we disclose to our customer that, sure enough, we want to obviously protect them in such a way, but we don't want to kind of overstep our bounds. And it's really kind of outside the kind of the province that I have as a technologist. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. All right, I think we're doing pretty good here. Let me kind of talk about a couple of things. I won't show you the TV commercial. You probably have all seen portions of it, but I just talked about this. This is the ability, kind of our answer is really putting the customer in control and trying to get, these things that the company wants to do to help kind of protect it and legitimacy. How do you actually expose it and get it to kind of the customer so the customer can interact and the customer has the choices? So I wanted to get back to your question on kind of opt-in or opt-out. And one of the questions, like, we have the ability to do alerts. We can alert you for every single transaction, and we can do it based on what your request is. I was just out in Europe talking about this, and one of the questions came up that said, there's some people who are just impulsive. They don't have the ability to kind of control their spend and stuff. And they asked the question in that frame, and I said, that's kind of an interesting view, is that maybe we need to opt some of these alerts on, right? So then you individually can come in and turn them off, versus opting out or opting off, and then you have to go in and turn them on. So that might be an answer that we can pursue or think about in the future. But we have them, and the customers seem to really love them, and it really helps us a lot when we see transactions maybe that are high spend, and the customer says, look, I want you to notify me on my mobile device or an email or something that's a high spend transaction. All right, so some other things that are happening. I like the fact you guys are already thinking and probably actually know, in many ways, kind of more things than I know in these spaces. But how many people are aware that driver's licenses are coming to your mobile devices and are going to go in the secure element? It's happening right now. 3 states are in the process of looking at that. So now your driver's license is in the secure element on the phone. So question that says, how do we become an IT instigator and help the organization think? Here's a good example of that. So the fact that the driver's license is on the phone, what happens if the consumer now applies from the phone, right? Can the consumer just send us their driver's license, right, by a fingerprint and send it to us on the phone? That's really a frictionless way to do it, and we get some more reliable information. How about a time of authorization? If you have your driver's license on the phone and you're purchasing with the phone, is there ability for us to interact with you, the customer, And you can say, hey, by the way, feel free to check my phone to make sure I'm a legitimate person, and I can look at your license. So here's where digital, right, an artifact that is approved by the government, secured on your phone, may actually begin to help us kind of solve some of the challenges of verifying both the user and the device. So, yeah.
Joe, how do all of these changes around identity verification change the way we think about what identity really is in the Discover Cards kind of world? Like, you know, once upon a time, right, our identity was, as you mentioned, face-to-face and in person.
Yeah.
Now increasingly it's through digital means. Like, how does that evolving understanding of what identity is impact the business?
Yeah, I think this question about identity has been kind of very difficult, because at the end of the day, we're trying to verify a customer, right? And a customer is going to interact through all of these intermediary ways, right? Whether it's a phone, plastic, whether they decide to kind of appear in the branch. So however it is, we have to service them multimodal. But we don't, I mean, yeah, the device itself has an identity, right? So we know that that's different than maybe my watch or somebody else's phone. But I'm not so much interested in that. I'm interested in the customer. And the customer is just revealing themselves to me through these intermediary devices. So we really think of identity as really, that's the customer, right? And that's who we're trying to reach and interact with and give entitlements to. And I think we are now finding in many ways that we have awkward interactions, you know, with companies and stuff, because companies are so trying to enforce the identity, right? You know, hey, can my wife have a conversation with you on the line? Oh, she's not on the account, right? And you have things that are happening there. There was a recent thing that was just done, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to recall it right offhand, but it was related to, I think, more kind of elder abuse and the ability for folks to have some sort of trusted person on their account so they can now call up and get disclosure, because these things are becoming increasingly important, that we want to authenticate the end user and we want to give them the entitlements that they deserve, but not beyond that. So one of the things that we're finding, has anybody done the airport system called CLEAR? Okay, so what is CLEAR, right? CLEAR is this kind of, if we start looking at it, they're really an identity network. And you have already opted into CLEAR, and you're using it for your ability to go through the airport lines very quickly, right? Well, can CLEAR be used, you know, for us as a company or other companies to help you also establish identity, right? And these are these notions of saying, you know, do you have the ability to kind of take on identity and decide who you're going to reveal it to, right? And really, we're trying to figure out a way, you know, the power of sharing identity be put into the consumer. You know, credit bureaus today capture a lot of information from you, but how many of you have the ability to opt in who's going to your credit report and looking at stuff? I think that's the trend, right? That trend is moving towards, you know, the individual customer is going to be able to kind of do a lot of that. We've been playing with blockchain. I think blockchain is kind of an interesting promise, right? That, and this is just a little example of what we're doing around this business payments federated directory. But the notion here is that if information is on a blockchain, can you reveal portions of that blockchain to who you said it's going to? So let's say that you're going to apply for a car loan. And can you be the one that says, hey, that car company is okay to contact Discover to actually verify that I have a deposit account, but nobody else is, right? And can it be enforced by the blockchain and use that? You've got a lot of companies that are starting to take a look at this and what I like about it is this piece on the bottom, that the consumer can share only the data that is necessary and to whom they choose, right? That's really the promise. You're going to see this still unfold over time. Right, so you know, I think blockchain is like long on promise, maybe short on product at this point. So maybe in a few years, you're really going to see this unfold. All right, I'm going to talk just, I got like 5 minutes here. Thanks for the questions. And I'm just going to talk a little bit on the IT instigator role, which is really this slide, and I think that's it. So as an IT instigator, what I have done is I've essentially created this radar. Like, what technologies would we need to look at that likely are going to affect the consumer and the consumer interaction? And some of those have already kind of hit the shore. So I put a little view together, and why I call this kind of the hurricane model is, if you think about hurricanes, Hurricanes are observable well before they're a hurricane, right? They start off as a tropical depression, and then some of those become tropical storms. Some of those become hurricanes, and only some hurricanes even hit land and cause destruction, right? So, but we can see them, and we can put the radar, and we can start forecasting them. So if you look at technology in the same way, you could say, well, can I start forecasting what is likely to hit the shores? And if I think about it also like a physical hurricane, when it does hit the shore, it's going to affect everything in that area, right? You know, the residents, the businesses, all businesses, not just some businesses. And so how do we think about this as we kind of move across and say, what are the technologies that are really going to likely kind of inform us and inform our customers that something is going to change? And they're not all near term, right? Some of them have already hit shore and we've dealt with them and moved on. Some of them are still offshore for us. And while the timing may still be kind of in flux, they're really kind of indicative of when things are going to come through. Like, when did it have to appear on a radar for us to get prepared for it? And I'll just take the one on the far right, 5G. What is 5G going to do? Well, 5G is going to create speeds that are faster than your Wi-Fi network when you're outside of a Wi-Fi zone. And so now maybe my communication to a customer via the mobile device is pretty simple, right? It's fast. And maybe we can send more information. Maybe we can go to video. Maybe we can go to the ability to have customers looking at the screen and doing things. That's going to inform a lot of what we can do digitally in the future, and the way customers interact with us as a company and a lot of companies. And so that's what I do a lot for this IT instigator role. I help gain authority over the emerging tech so our Discover customers can kind of benefit through their use. This just was the closed slide, same thing, just in little picture form. So we managed to get it in. Questions? No, that's it. Questions, we still got a few more minutes. So
Thinking about the cost of all this, right? From an innovation for trust versus innovating for profit, how do you balance and prioritize those two things? And I know a little bit about your company, and like, you all created a lot of tools that seem to be great for the consumer, great for trust, but not necessarily great for profit. Or do you think those things drive profit?
yeah, I'm going to have to, I think from my perspective, one maybe kind of influences the other, right? So Discover, if you go look at kind of our history, we've won a lot of top company awards in our industry and for many years in a row, right? We've got a string. Matter of fact, I think we just run J.D. Power for the 5th out of 6 years in a row as America's kind of best credit card. And it's because the tools that we put into the customer's hands allow them to interact, with the organization. But some of those tools are kind of do both, right? So I mentioned the ability to maybe use the driver's license, right, to help kind of establish trust. Driver's licenses do something else. They help you pre-fill a lot of the form, right? So, if I could scrape all the information from, the driver's license and the bureau and stuff and actually fill out half the form for you, it actually makes your experience better, right? And so, some of these things, they're kind of the opposite side of the coin. And I think you find that we have to innovate for both, but at the end of the day, this right party contact is what we're about, right? We have to enforce that. You have to kind of your basic playing ticket, right? Your entry to the game. You got to get that stuff right. So, yes.
I read somewhere that one of the design flaws of the internet is that when people access it, they can't identify themselves as who they are. All these like multi-factor authentication and different technologies are kind of like band-aids for that. If there was like a more elegant solution that you could idolize, what would it be, and is it being held up by something like regulation or anything like that?
Yeah, so the question really comes around the formation of the internet, and you read about it, they left security out, right? And security being left out has caused kind of all these challenges. I'm not sure what the perfect solution is. You look at companies such as India, who's gone to this now national database with biometrics, Aadhaar, and is that a perfect solution? It feels like a good solution, hasn't been hacked yet, right? If that happens, then maybe all of a sudden that perfect solution is a little less perfect. So I don't really know. I mean, I think this is, I think it's going to continue to be multimodal, multi-factor, and the U.S. has kind of gone, especially in our industry, it's like this anonymous society, right? That you can apply for a credit card because your information was on a bureau and it was curated and stuff. And that's much different than having to appear, right? And so kind of as you go through that, you're like, well, anonymity has kind of left all of these things that have to be solved, and that's, I think, a real challenge for us. It's never going to go away, right? It's just the way we formed, and maybe there will be a new internet that will be created that will think of it, but at this point, it seems like it's a real challenge. Yes?
What's Discover's philosophy on leveraging third-party data to help inform decisioning on kind of account opening or fraud? And then where you guys do have gaps, are you using techniques like synthetic ID or machine learning to try to close gaps that you have?
So I can only answer maybe part of that question, right? So, if you look at a credit bureau, for example, that already is, a third-party data. So we utilize, third parties to make a credit decision. If you're asking me questions around maybe innovative ways or other third-party, I don't know the answer to kind of how we do that. But what we have to do is, like any data that we use to do things like opening accounts, we have to go through kind of permissible use as an organization. You don't want to bias your model in your organization. So we have to go through and say, our goal at the end of the day is to make the best decision possible with the best data and kind of disclosed to the customer, so there's not a surprise. But I can't answer your question in depth because I don't get involved in that side of the equation. All right, so I can see the clock behind you. I think we've got maybe time for this last question, and then.
So we've talked a lot about trying to identify consumers, but based on the channel and the device diagrams that we've looked at, we know there's more and more system communication.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes people forget about security system to system. So are you pursuing innovation or thinking about that in a different way? Is API definition and all this stuff is becoming more relevant for it?
Yeah, so the answer is broadly yes. So like tokenization is an ability for us to actually essentially kind of obfuscate some data that would be kind of in the public domain to make sure that in all the networks it's encrypted. So there's a network standard, right, that we enforce that every time a transaction goes across a network boundary, it must be re-encrypted, right? So we have a key exchange key, so we go and we take it out of one and we re-encrypt it. So the idea is that it's not in the clear at any point, and if it's stolen at some point, it can't be kind of easily brought back. So we have to think about that all the time, right? How do you secure APIs? How do you secure any type of network exchange, data exchange that's going back and forth to encrypt it and to obfuscate the data? Data is actually broken into 3 or 4 levels. You've got critical risk data, high risk data, and data, I guess, is the other one. And as you get into those higher pieces, that you want to make sure that your ability to encrypt and solve is very well done. And then our industry subscribes to a standard called PCI, Payment Card Industry Standard, which really forces encryption across all different players on the network. That being said, there's still been hacks and there's still been exposure. So, well, thank you, everyone. We've managed to get to right to 1 o'clock. Appreciate it. Oh,
And as a token for thanks, I have some Tuck goodies in here.
thank you. I won't have to wear
as well.
bring my Kellogg stuff everywhere now. So,
Green's a really nice color.
yeah. So,
But we really want to
thank
appreciate you
you.
for sharing a little bit more about it. All right, thanks everyone.